Can people hear me okay? Yeah, okay, perfect. I'm Rosco Hunter, and over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to hopefully try to outline our paper exploiting network compressibility and topology in ZeroCost NAS. So our general approach kind of exploits redundancies in how networks learn and represent information to quickly predict their performance. Specifically, we proposed two routes for assessing compressibility, one looking at the gradients, the other looking at activation patterns. So in this talk, I'll start by considering existing work in ZeroCost NAS. And then I'll demonstrate how our compressibility framework can both explain and extend these methods. So first, let me introduce the topic of ZeroCost NAS for those who may not be familiar with it. The general aim of NAS is to locate a high-performance neural network within a search space of possible designs. However, many approaches require the full or partial training of a neural network, a costly step that hinders performance. In contrast, zero-cost proxies have been proposed as a low-latency approach. They take an initialized neural network as their input and perform some calculations to give an output. And larger outputs hopefully correlate to better architectures, allowing you to distinguish the good from the bad network designs. In other words, they effectively evaluate properties of untrained networks to try to predict their trained performance. Clearly, this has a number of practical applications in rapidly finding high-performance neural networks. However, it also has theoretical importance, allowing researchers to both quantify and compare their best intuitions about the factors that underlie network success. So many zero-cost proxies were developed out of the pruning literature, in which the importance of every parameter is measured via a saliency score. Some of the most common are on the screen: grad norm, SNP, grasp, SynFlow. Now, regardless of their specific formulas, these all try to quantify the effect that a parameter has on the flow of information in a network. But to get a zero-cost proxy from these parameter-level scores, they must be condensed somehow into a single number for each network. And this is typically achieved by summing all the saliency scores in the network. To clarify the terminology for those who may not be familiar, the proxy generated by summing the saliency scores, some type of saliency score, is typically given the same name as the score. So for example, summing all the SNP scores in a neural network would generally be called in a zero-cost proxy context as SNP. However, neural networks are not simply the sum of their parts. And this naive approach to saliency aggregation potentially discards important statistical information about the network. This motivated us to consider the problem of combining saliencies into network-level scores. We found that amongst existing metrics, ZeCo stood out as an empirically strong method that goes beyond mere saliency aggregation. ZeCo was presented originally as a kind of natural consequence of some theories relating to the convergence rate and generalization capacity of neural networks. However, we believe that ZeCo's success is the result of a more general phenomena. As such, we propose an alternative explanation to the kind of formulas on the screen, and we propose that ZeCo is effectively a measure of compressibility, which it does by taking a signal-to-noise ratio, where it takes the expectation and variance of gradient size over the input data. The intuition here is that a high variance gradient is suggestive of training dynamics, in which a small subset of the inputs dominates the training dynamics, those with the largest gradient. This compressible gradient suggests that the network is effectively unable to use all available data, and thus will perform poorly. Now, it's worth noting here that ZeCo, this is kind of our interpretation as a measure of compressibility, here uses gradient size as its kind of saliency score. However, in our more general perspective, ZeCo is just any measure of compressibility over the data samples and could use any saliency score, not just the size of the gradient. So it could also use SNP, grasp, or SynFlow. So motivated by this more general interpretation of an existing metric, ZeroCost, we considered whether assessing the compressibility over a network's parameters instead of its data samples could also prove insightful and demonstrate the kind of flexibility of this compressibility perspective. So we proposed SSNR, a measure of parameter compressibility. So it's the saliency signal-to-noise ratio is the kind of acronym. And it, in this case, a high-variance saliency over the parameters suggests that only a small subset of the parameters are useful and the rest are somewhat redundant. So while ZeroCost exploits compressibility to identify when a network is unable to learn from data, SSNR exploits compressibility to identify when a network is unable to effectively learn using its parameters. But before we continue, it's also probably worth pointing out that both of these measures are layer-wise. And our choice to include a layer-wise partition in SSNR was motivated by ZeroCost, an existing metrics precedent, but also by some conservation laws of synaptic saliency that make this a natural choice. So to recap so far, this hopefully motivates some kind of framework for looking at saliency compressibility. But we wondered whether this kind of general approach of compressibility can be applied further in a more general scenario to also affect activation patterns. So every piece of input data elicits an activation pattern. These partition the input space and represent a large part of how a network understands the input information it's being given. An existing metric, NASWAT, already measures, in our opinion, the compressibility of activation patterns, which are here denoted by CI for the activation pattern corresponding to the ith piece of input data. Now, NASWAT does this by generating a kernel through taking the dot product of distinct activation patterns and taking their log determinant to generate the final proxy. This effectively measures both the number of neurons in the network and how decorrelated they are over the inputs. The intuition being that decorrelated activation patterns will be easier for the network to separate during training. So in the previous slide, I hopefully motivated, in some sense, why you'd want a layer-wise partition for saliency scores. However, we also wondered whether this layer-wise partition can improve activation compressibility as well as saliency compressibility. As such, we generated a kernel for each layer's activation patterns and summed their log determinants to produce a layer-wise version of NASWAT, a layer-wise measure of activation compressibility over the data. We found that this layer-wise version improved upon the original in a fair number of search spaces. So we've now proposed two novel methods for layer-wise compressibility, SSNR, which focuses on saliencies, or gradients, or parameters, and NASWAT, which focuses on activation patterns. And through a series of experiments that we outlined in our paper, we found these tend to be kind of somewhat orthogonal. And intuitively, we believe this is because the gradient parameter level assessments, SSNR, tend to look more for trainability, and the activation patterns generally look more towards expressivity of a network. And as such, now we're armed with these kind of two complementary metrics. We wondered whether they could be combined with a layer-wise dot product to produce a topological proxy for compressible expressivity and trainability T-set, which improves upon SSNR in a number of search spaces. Perhaps, though, even more importantly, SSNR demonstrates the feasibility of direct metric combination, an area of research that is yet still quite unexplored. So far, I've kind of tried to make somewhat of a case for why you'd be interested in compressibility, but I haven't showed any results. So firstly, here are some results on the classic collection of architectures, NASBench 201, and we assessed the correlation between how the metrics ranked different architectures in this search space and their true performance. And importantly here, for the compressibility approach, we see that SSNR improve significantly upon SNP, which is just taking the mere sum of the SNP scores as opposed to their signal-to-noise ratio. Moving to a more practical search space, we considered ZenNAS, which contains both residual and bottleneck blocks. Here we used T-set in aging evolution, and we found that we were able to locate architectures that outperformed other examples. Now, these two results on the screen are only a fraction of the total amount of search spaces and tasks that we considered in our paper. And we believe that our consistent success of our compressibility perspective with SSNR and T-set further kind of bolsters our claim for why you'd want to consider compressibility in generating new zero-cost proxies. So, in summary, I've hopefully shown how our paper explains and extends some existing work in zero-cost NAS. More generally, though, I hope it motivates more research in condensing these parameter-level and neuron-level information into network-level metrics, and ways for combining these distinct metrics into more holistic measures of network performance. If you're interested in the ideas outlined in our paper, then please check out our paper or in the poster session for more. I'd be happy to chat it through. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got some time for a couple questions. One from Frank, if you can. Oh, no catch yet. Okay.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I was wondering if you have tried this metric in, as a routine in NAS algorithms or anything like that?
Sorry, I didn't quite get the end of the question.
Have you tried this approach as a subroutine within NAS algorithms?
Well, I guess, for example, the ZenNAS example is possibly the closest to what you're asking with that, where we effectively used it instead of performance to look at, to perform aging evolution. So I guess there it's kind of being used alongside your classic NAS approaches. But it could probably be used alongside other NAS methods. So I don't know, it could provide, let's say, a quick method to discard the really obvious bad cases. And then you could use some classic NAS approaches to kind of refine at the real top end what you're finding. So yeah, we didn't look more into that, but the ZenNAS results are probably the closest we have to that.
Thanks. Yeah, very cool approach. Thanks for the talk. One question. So the score, the SN, that you divide them by the variance in the SSNR.
Yeah.
So this requires the gradients, right?
Yes, or some saliency score. We're dividing by a gradient, or which would be calculated with gradients.
Then, like, it depends on like a subset of the training data that you use to compute the gradients, or
yes,
do you really?
That's a good question. It's just a mini batch should be used.
So you don't use the whole training data, but only a mini batch.
Yes.
So this then could, like, if you sample, I mean, you sample randomly, I guess, but then it could really depend on how the mini batch looks like, then also like how the gradients look like, right? So it's.
Yeah, there will be, some variation with the data you're using, the seed you're using to initialize, something like that. However, we found that, and other work looked into, I can't think of the exact papers off the top of my head, but finding that, these zero-cost proxies can be relatively robust to things like initialization. Because effectively, you can imagine a network, let's say, that's got a residual connection in a certain place and a bottleneck in another, will almost no matter how you initialize it or what data you use, be better or worse than some other examples.
Yeah, okay, thanks. And then maybe to my actual question, I don't know the convention, but if you have to compute the forward pass and backward pass, like, is this then zero cost still?
I mean, it's so close to, zero cost, I guess, is a loose term. There's some methods. So ZenNAS is a method that uses 2 examples. It's quite a flexible term, but it's so close to 0 compared to the cost of fully training a network that you effectively call it 0.
All right.
One final question from Frank.
Nice. Good throw. Yeah, thanks. Very nice talk. Very nice work. I have one question. So we had this paper on NAS Bench Suite 0 back then, where we had 28 different benchmarks and evaluated a lot of different ZeroCost proxies. And they tended to sometimes be great and sometimes be really bad. Do you have any intuition if your method is going to be good somewhere or is going to be bad somewhere?
I mean, I guess I'd be overly hopeful if I was saying it's not going to be bad anywhere. There's obviously going to be some such space you can find always where it'll perform poorly. That's why, I mean, in the paper we tried to, I could only really show a few examples here just for time, but in the paper we tried to do as many search spaces as we could. And we kind of were able to consistently beat most methods with either SSNR or TSET, one of these 2 compressibility measures. So that's, we have some hope that it seems to generalize better. But yeah, I'd be happy to be proven wrong by future work that kind of builds on this.
Yeah, it'd be cool if we can try to put it in NAS Bench Suite. I think one line and then just a bunch of experiments should go through directly because we already have it set up so that I hope that might work. Let's try together.
Okay, please join me in congratulating Rosco once again.